Well, hello, everybody. My name is Kendall Coleman, and I am the founder and CEO of Total Coaching Systems. And we are an executive coaching and consultancy that focuses on helping ignite and inspire leaders for the most challenging issues we face. And today's topic is finding the S in ESG. I'm super excited to be introducing you all to Patsy Doerr, and she is our guest speaker today on this topic. And Patsy and I are going to be having a masterclass in a few weeks that we'll talk to you about it at the end. And we'd love for you to come. That's going to expand on these ideas a little bit more in depth. So Patsy, welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of the program and to be talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, personally and professionally. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. So yes, so Patsy, I'm thrilled to announce that you and I are going to be working together at Total Coaching Systems, doing some of this important consultant work. And you are leveraging 20+ year career in senior positions in HR, in social impact, in diversity and inclusion, and even most recently in a C-level role for ESG, which I'm super excited to try to help companies have that as a senior level CEO C-level position going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, as you just alluded to for our listeners, so 20, 25, maybe 30 years experience, again, in leadership roles across the human capital space and social impact, and with a deep focus on diversity and inclusion and ultimately ESG. And I think it's a really important time for this topic because more and more organizations in recent years, 5 to 10, and certainly in the past 2 to 3, particularly now during the pandemic and post-pandemic, are very heavily focused on ESG issues. What's the value? What's the purpose? Why care about it? And to actually do something about it, because it is very important for organizational success in today's society.
And we all focus, right, on ESG is becoming so important. I mean, you can't really go on LinkedIn or in the press at all and not see an article on a daily basis that focuses more around the environment and the E part of ESG. So I'd love to just take a step back and help people understand that there's so much more going on inside ESG than just the environmental aspect, which is incredibly important, I know, to all of us. But today, we're going to be talking about sort of the one that doesn't get as much limelight time is the S.
Yeah, absolutely, Kendall. So, I mean, it's fascinating to me, having been in the space now for quite some time, how there is a real opportunity, I think, to educate leaders and many people in society on what ESG actually means, and particularly, as you alluded to, beyond the E. I mean, so many organizations are heavily focused on the environmental components of ESG, which are certainly critical and of great importance. And I think a reason for that is because they are the most tangible aspects of ESG and the most easily measured and directly linked to operational performance than the S or even the G. And as well, right, that to me, I think, is a big driver. And I'd say the second key driver is that the SEC has been heavily focused on the environmental aspects of ESG. So a lot of organizations now are bound to, or will be bound to, more guidelines and requirements around reporting and activities on the E aspect of ESG, and ultimately the entire ESG spectrum, if you will.
Yeah. So, okay, so yeah, can we define a little bit what do we mean by ESG, and what is the social, what goes under the social aspect of the ESG?
Sure. So the way I look at it, and I think, there's a lot of different words articulated to describe ESG, but really at the end of the day, ESG is social impact, right? It is about the entire spectrum of environment, social issues, and governance and leadership issues that drive business and social impact. So it really is that broad spectrum of initiatives and activities in that space. I would also draw a parallel to what many organizations call sustainability, which also often is linked to the environment, but is actually much broader than that. So, sustainability, corporate responsibility, social impact, ESG, to me, they're all the same thing. They're all the
Mhm.
same thing, right? It's all that spectrum of ESG issues. And if you think about the ESG component at the next level of granularity, you then start to think about what are those measures to actually determine success and progress against those goals. And then secondarily, specific to your question, what is the S? Because that's really the key question that we're focusing on today. The S is twofold primarily. There's really an internal component. When I say internal, I mean internal to an organization or an ecosystem, which is really the people component. So leadership behaviors, culture, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which is very important these days. In fact, most organizations are switching their gears to belonging and a little bit less emphasis on diversity, but to really create that culture. So that's the internal piece of the S. And then you have the more what I call external piece of the S, which is really about community engagement. How do organizations get involved in the communities where they live and work? And that has other elements to it too. I mean, that's giving back in many ways. So, how do we give back to our communities? But it's also about human rights. How do companies take statements or take stands, I should say, on human rights issues? It's also about data protection, another part of the S that people don't necessarily think about so naturally, right? How do we protect the data of our clients or our customers, depending on the nature of the business? So those are really the key components of the S from the internal and the external perspective.
That is very helpful. I know in the masterclass we're going to talk about sort of the 9 different ways to create a strategic plan around this. And is there one that is your favorite to start with as people are starting to put pen to paper and create their strategy around social
Sure.
impact?
Sure. I might push it to 2 if that's okay. But I
Yeah,
will
sure.
but I will not give away all 9 yet because we want people to come to our masterclass. So
That's
note
right.
to our listeners. Um, but the 2 that I would say are the most critical in my experience are the following. Number 1, leadership support and real active engagement on the topic, right? A lot of organizations talk a really good game about what they do about ESG, what they're doing about diversity and inclusion, and all of these issues, and don't necessarily take the appropriate action. And the reality is that an ESG strategy, a diversity and inclusion strategy, a human capital strategy is not going to work in any organization unless the CEO and senior leadership is fully behind it and fully actively engaged. So that's number 1. And number 2, which I think is really at the core of almost anything that we do, is education. I think many people simply just don't know what they don't know, all of us included. And to give people the opportunity to really understand, what is ESG? What are these issues specifically? What can someone individually or an organization as a whole do to impact change and to drive progress across these areas? And I think the education component is just absolutely critical to understand those behaviors, to understand the why, to understand how to get there, and ultimately how to measure success.
I hear also kind of how to put a business case then together for that.
Absolutely, Kendall. 100% putting the business case together. I see that as, and actually it's one of the 9 components as well, but it is part of the education piece, because if you can't get your head around the why, in my view, then you're not really going to be engaged on the topic. And so I think building that business and social case, frankly, from the beginning and educating people on that really drives engagement in the topics.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm interested. So, let's say I'm a CEO that has never, hasn't really been interested in this topic. It's been more about let's grow the company. And now sort of these extrinsic forces are coming in and saying, you have to do it this way. Here are some mandates that you have to do it on the E side. Here's some things you have to do on the G, on the governance side.
Mhm.
And so with how much, and do you have any suggestions to kind of rattle the intrinsic motivation of a CEO who may not really have this? For me, I'm a world traveler, as you are, and that really shaped my vision of this is a very big world, and there's many different people that make this whole unique tapestry of life so beautiful. But if I've never, let's say that's something maybe never left my town, or how do we help a company intrinsically motivate themselves?
It's a great question. And it's true, right? Our experiences, particularly globally, but just our experiences generally, where we can learn from multiple conversations, definitely can, if you don't have the opportunity to do that, can be limiting in terms of really truly understanding and truly appreciating these topics. But if I'm talking to a CEO or a senior business executive who is focused on building the business and of course driving financial performance, I would say the following: why should they care, right? I mean, I think first of all, it's about attracting talent. We know, for example, and there's a lot of statistics out there, which I'm happy to quote as we continue our discussions ongoing in the coming weeks. But we know, for example, that 8 out of 10 millennials make their decisions on the organizations they're going to work for based on how serious that organization is committed to ESG and social impact issues. So one is about attracting talent. The other is about attracting investors. And I just had a conversation this morning, actually, with someone that I've worked with over the years, just about how investors are really putting the pressure, frankly, on organizations to care about ESG and to put strategies, people, and metrics and activities in place, and activities that are part of a meaningful strategy, not activities for the sake of activities. So investors are asking more and more questions, and they're asking more and more questions because they want to invest in companies that care about this stuff. And I can tell you that the impact investing business has grown significantly over the past 5 to 7 years at about 25% a year. And in fact, by 2025, assets under management in the impact investing space will be at 53 trillion US dollars. And this is about 1/3 of all assets under management. So it's pretty extensive. And if you're talking to someone who cares about financial performance, a CEO or otherwise, you can quote these numbers, right? And say, look, people are investing their money, and that's where it gets down to the bottom line, in organizations that do well in this space. And we also know that if investors are paying attention, we know that there is a causal relationship between effective social impact ESG strategies and financial performance. And that's because there's also an impact that leads us to the performance factor around customer and employee loyalty, employee engagement, productivity, and ultimately the bottom line. And then finally, I would say the fourth component that is really important to help leaders in business understand is that by having an effective ESG social impact strategy in place, you are building better and more sustainable business operations for the future. And that, again, gets us back to performance and financial performance, which is really at the heart of where many business people's minds are focused as they think about ESG.
And I wonder, what are some of the important development pieces that you've seen, especially for women? And I know in my career, I've really had to access a deep well of courage many times to have very difficult conversations, usually with a client, but also, also, let's say, on board positions, or to remind people. For example, I remember one board that I was on where I ended up in bringing on many different women to the organization, and it actually saved the organization financially because of how many members we added to the organization. But they were all executive women. And I remember a judge saying to me something very very inappropriate, I'll say, about the, that who I brought in, and that I was, making it a more female driven organization, and he didn't like that. And he said, then I said, well, I don't know how to take that, but as a compliment. And he's used a very vulgar word that I won't say here, but I remember I just said, well, I don't know how to receive that, but as a compliment. And I just walked away. And then 2 years later, he said to me, I want to apologize for everything I said to you, and I want to, to your face and behind your back, because now this organization is so vibrant and the conversations are so much interest, and there's so much more interesting because of the women. And not to make it a male female, but we know that when women are in equal numbers, that ROI goes up as much as 35%, and that organizations do better when women are, especially on boards, on equal numbers and on the senior team. So really, it's also about like really helping women and minorities, people of color, to advocate for themselves in ways that don't make it like something's getting taken away from you, but something's going to be added to you, if that makes sense. But I think that there's a big need there.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. It's this is a slightly divergent thought, but it's certainly related to the larger gender issue at hand. And the research tells us that when I say we, I mean globally, all organizations and individuals continue at the pace that we are in terms of women advancing in business, that it will take 100 years, right, to reach gender parity.
Right.
And that has been out there as a piece of research for years, which is really, I mean, I'm a complete optimist and I believe that we can make great change. But when you see that year after year, you realize, well, gosh, what on earth do we have to do in addition, right? And I think there's a couple different things. I mean, I think if we look at it at a macro level and you think of it again at an organizational level, the opportunity is to ensure that every strategy focused on diversity and inclusion, and therefore, as we're talking about gender specifically today, needs to apply to every aspect of the employee life cycle, from attracting talent to recruiting talent to development, advancement, engagement, and ultimately retention. And so if you don't apply a diversity and inclusion lens to all aspects of that employee life cycle, it's almost impossible to really drive systemic change. And so that's really important, right? At the organizational level. I think to your specific question around individual behaviors, I think it's important to really understand why we behave the way we do. I mean, unconscious bias training is a word that we've all used, heard of, been through for years. But it really is a very powerful concept because, again, we don't know what we don't know. And I think it is important to go through that exercise, both men and women, both diverse and non-diverse in certain categories, to really understand both your conscious and your unconscious biases, to really understand what drives your behavior, and then ultimately to understand how that behavior impacts other individuals. So as women in particular, we have to be conscious of that. And we need to be able to support women. I think, historically, and I'll speak very honestly and openly, Kendall, women haven't necessarily been so supportive of one another. And I think that came from the fact that there weren't that many women in leadership. And so they felt they had gone through a certain exercise to get there and that others would need to go through the same. And I think that has definitely changed in the past 10 to 20 years. But there is still an opportunity to encourage more and more women, all of us, to play a more active role in terms of mentoring and guiding the next generation and supporting them. And then finally, I would say that also encouraging all of us at any stage of our careers to use our voice. And you use the example of the individual you worked with utilizing an inappropriate word and an inappropriate situation, really, in terms of the observation of the situation, but to call it out. Use our voices to say, that is not appropriate. I don't feel comfortable, and let's change the subject or let's move on. And I think it's really important for us to encourage people to use their voices and give them the tools to use their voices most effectively.
Mm. You talked about belonging. I'm curious, is that part of what we'll cover in the masterclass in terms of really giving some ideas on how to create belonging both internally but then externally with your community as you mentioned?
Absolutely. Oh, definitely. We could talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for as long as people like. But definitely, I think it's so important. I think it's really the core of so much of what we're trying to achieve together, and all of us. Um, Definitely, it's interesting how diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging has evolved over the years, right? And there's a lot of research out there too. If you look at it when it first started as a movement per se, let's say 30 years ago, it was really about compliance, right? And it was simply
Yes.
about diversity and compliance. And now over the years, you've seen that shift dramatically. And where the primary shift is, in my observation and experience, is that there's much more focus on inclusion and belonging. So I always say, and this is fairly crude way of saying it, but you can bring in as many diverse people as you like into any organization, any team, any system, but the culture doesn't support them, it's not going to work anyway. So what's the point? You're actually wasting your time and your money, and you're actually, creating disengaged employees, both diverse and non-diverse, depending on the category, if you will. So you're seeing more and more about that. And the belonging piece is quite interesting, because what happens when you create a culture of belonging is that people feel valued and they feel heard. And that's when we are most engaged, and that's when we're most productive. And that's what we're trying to achieve. And in fact, one of my most favorite quotes that I've heard, I didn't come up with it myself, but I've heard in recent years that I think really encapsulates this whole concept, is that diversity is a fact, inclusion is an action, and belonging is the outcome. Which I know
Love
is
it.
pretty powerful, right? Because it shows
Yes.
kind of the spectrum of activity of what we're trying to achieve. And ultimately, belonging is where you want to be.
Yeah. And I'm curious, like, do you have? I was thinking about a biopharma company that I'm working with right now, and they have people from all over the world that work there. And one of the things that we did was put up a map of the world, and that everybody could put where they were from, right?
Mhm.
And so that then the whole world was represented, and then we've done things where we'll have, the person from that country will be in charge of saying this is the food that we're going to make for this potluck at after work, or and so that then now they're experiencing other countries, for example. I just love that in terms of the belonging that it created and the excitement that it created. And I'm curious, like, do you have any top of mind clients or folks that you've worked with that have done ways to really tangibly build that belonging?
Yeah, it's also a great question, and you raised the global piece, which I think is really critical. Another conversation that I had just in the past couple of days, actually last night and this morning, is basically the fact that I think when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when I say we, I mean the collective we. What's often not paid enough attention to is the global cultural competence component, because that's equally as important as other aspects of diversity, right? If we don't fully appreciate cultures and where people came from, why they communicate the way they do, why they feel the way they do, we can't be effective in terms of creating an inclusive environment where people feel a sense of belonging. So, a very tangible way to achieve that is education. Again, getting back to helping people understand what cultural competence is and how to operate in a global environment. Many of us have had the opportunity to live and work in other countries, but not everybody has that opportunity. But they
Yeah.
certainly have the opportunity to talk to people from other countries, to
Yes.
read on other cultures,
Three.
right? And to be exposed to it in different ways. And I think that's a real opportunity for all of us. And I would also say that the other piece that's important around inclusion and belonging, and there are many, many components that we can get into more during our masterclass, is really this opportunity to create safe environments where, again, people feel heard and they feel comfortable speaking with their voice and talking about how they feel in particular situations. A lot of organizations, some that I've been involved in driving the strategy for, offer opportunities like that where people can come and talk about a particular topic. And it may be a tragedy. I know post the murder of George Floyd, a lot of organizations held safe space conversations just because people needed to talk about it. They needed to express their opinions. They needed to express, more importantly, their feelings. And so
Yeah.
that's another way where organizations can really take belonging to the next level, to create those environments for people to have those types of conversations.
Love it. Well, Patsy, in closing, is there anything else you'd like to just tease the audience with in terms of what we'll be covering on February 10th? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to go grab the flyer here so that everybody can see that. So I'll be right back. But please, if you would, just give a little bit, anything else you'd like to share.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think in closing, before you all come and attend our masterclass, yes, I was a salesperson to begin with, so here we are selling our masterclass.
Yes.
But I believe one of the most important things to remember is that there is nothing soft about people. Remember years ago, we used to talk about relationship skills, training, and development as soft skills. There's nothing soft about those skills. And there's nothing soft about being in the people space. A company exists because of its people. A company is comprised of its people, as is society. And so I tell you that because when we talk about focusing on the S in ESG, it's all about the people. And that's really the core of ESG in terms of how we drive change and make an impact within organizations, individually, and society as a whole.
Love that. Yeah, you're reminding me, just this week I had a conversation where there's a lot of infighting going on in a company I'm working with. And I had a conversation, a very difficult conversation with the CEO. And he said, I'm so frustrated, I'm just going to start firing people if they don't do their job. And he said, we're not in we're not in the people business. We're in this, I won't say the industry they're in. I said, we are all in the people business.
Right.
Every business is about leadership and about a people business. And so if that's where you're coming from, there's a heavy road ahead, or we can go in this direction, which is really about creating that culture that is of high performance, where people trust each other, where people want to support each other, where they're comfortable with, hey, can I give you some feedback about how that went, right? I mean, like, really creating some more ease in conversations. And thankfully he said, okay, I'm with you. I get it. I'm just so frustrated. I just want people to get their job done. And I appreciate that. We all have the content of our work of, we want to get this done. We want to get this going forward. And the process of it, though, is the people, is the interconnectedness and the interrelational aspects that actually make a company what it is.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And the words you use are really important too, the content and the process, right? Neither works without the other.
Right. Yeah. So let me go ahead. This is so exciting. I'm really super excited for people to come. And let me just go ahead and put this up so people can just see that here is a little bit more if you want to just grab that snapshot, and we can also send it to you. But this is going to our 1 hour Zoom event. It's a free masterclass on how to drive social change and make a environment that focuses on inclusion. We'd love to have you there. If you're already interested in a longer program and consulting we can do with us, please reach out to us. And Patsy, thank you so much for taking the time today to give us this awesome overview of what we're going to be covering on February 10th and beyond.
Absolutely. Anytime. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for the opportunity.
You got it. Okay, so there we go.